Hey everybody, it's Jeff Miller, and welcome to the Free Yourself podcast, where we invite you to create space to flourish. It's day 8. I've made it to Columbus, Ohio. I'm going to overnight in Youngstown. But wow, I mean, I'm just blown away that I've made it this far. I've made it safely, knock on wood. And but I made it to my next guest, Dr. Angus Fletcher. Angus was one of the lecturers at my MAP program at Penn, the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program, and he literally was the number one person that blew my mind. And there were people blowing my mind there a lot, but he's number one. I'm really excited for him to share what his research is about, and I think it's going to come to surprise for everyone. He's a literary scholar, he's a neuroscientist, he's a best-selling author, and what he does is he reveals storytelling's profound ability to foster resilience, empathy, and human flourishing through empirical science, first of all, and deep exploration of narrative traditions. Angus illuminates literature's power to reshape identity, enhance emotional resilience, and navigate life's mysteries. Truly, all I've been doing is, for the past 8 days, is thinking about life's mysteries. So here I am, I get to chat with Angus about it. He's got acclaimed books, Wonderworks, please go out and get it. Story Thinking, please go out and get it. And his forthcoming Primal Intelligence, which I've ordered already, so I'm sure you're going to want to go out and get that. His books highlight how stories unlock our innate potential to engage with uncertainty, transform memories, and cross thresholds into the unknown, which of course aligns seamlessly with today's exploration of the numinous. I want to welcome my guest, Dr. Angus Fletcher.
Here he is. This is the man I've been talking about, Dr. Angus Fletcher. Angus, thank you so much. I forgot to mention that you're a professor at Ohio State University. And, coming in here to Ohio State, I drove through where the Wright Brothers Museum and whatnot. And we're in Ohio. And I was thinking about Rick Rubin, the producer. He made on his Instagram, there was a comment about delusional thinking, and that we're good to go against AI because what we have is thinking for the impossible. And the Wright brothers, when they were, trying to fly, there was no science, there was no data for how to fly. So they were just doing it because they thought they could.
Yeah. Well,
that's your work.
That is my work. Yeah. Fun fact about the Wright brothers. A few years before they went in the air in 1895, Lord Kelvin, who was the world's leading mathematician, so he knew everything about data, everything about statistics, he produced a proof that flight was impossible, that people would never fly. And the reason for that is because he was thinking of what we call probability.
Yeah.
So probability is based on data, and data is based on things that have happened before. Whereas to your point, what the Wright brothers were doing was they were thinking in possibility. And possibility is things that have never happened, but are possible because they don't break the laws of physics or nature or whatever. And one of the things I love about the Wright brothers is their dad used to allow them to stay home from school if they were willing to read books.
Right.
So if they would sit home and they would read these novels by like Charles Dickens and Washington Irving, and it would explode their imagination. And so just like Rick Rubin, because Rick Rubin, I mean, as I imagine, he spent a lot of time as a kid reading, feeding his mind, feeding that part of ourselves the computers don't have, telling those stories of the possible, but not probable. And that's really where all innovation comes from.
When we were in class and as reading your books, I had a little bit of a hard time connecting two things, and I feel like I've gotten a bit better of a handle on it. You talk a lot about divergent thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that divergent thinking was thinking completely the opposite or thinking in a different way. But divergent thinking actually is very logic-based, data-based, and that is what AI does. That is what computers do, and that is what they do better than we ever will do. And what you're talking about is narrative. What we do, the computers can never do.
That's right. Yeah. So one of the things about divergent thinking is, like you, before I started studying divergent thinking, I just thought it meant people who thought differently. Yeah. And I just thought, hey, people who diverge from the norm, of course, that's where creativity comes from. But actually, divergent thinking is a specific idea. It was coined by someone called J.P. Guilford in the 1950s. He'd been hired by the United States Army to crack the secret of creativity. And he had this belief that all intelligence was computational. And he believed this because he saw ENIAC, which was the world's first computer. And so he was like, everything, including creativity, can be reduced to computer protocols. And so he came up with divergent thinking and convergent thinking. That's the basis of brainstorming, all these kinds of things that were taught in business school. Now, when creatives hear that stuff, they don't pay any attention to the logical science beneath it, and they just go be creative. And that's why creatives a lot of times think that things like divergent thinking work, because they've been in a brainstorming session and it's worked. But the reality is that if you're a creative, which you are, you haven't been doing divergent thinking. You've actually been doing narrative thinking, and the key to narrative thinking is to spot exceptions and double down on them, which is what we do when we tell stories.
Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit about that, because this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I think that you're onto something big, Angus. I mean, I feel like this is, I'll tell you this. One of the things behind the tour is Marty Seligman's 51 and 51, right? The 51% of the world flourishing by 2051. And when I was in Sedona, I met with Rogelio Rodriguez, who's a shaman, and he said, no, 2033. And, that, and with rereading your books, and I'm feeling really hopeful lately about, things with AI. And I'm somebody that uses AI, and I'm a proponent of AI, but I'm a proponent of AI because what we bring to the table, AI can't. And I'm excited about that as a creative, and for the creative in everyone, not just creatives out there, but human beings, because that to me is our answer. And I could go on and on, because you've talked about teaching and how teaching has really not been handled properly. I don't know, maybe since Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, but at least in our contemporary school systems. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, as you know, I think Martin Seligman is a complete genius. He's like a definition of genius, and he's someone who should give us all optimism, because he basically came along and just transformed psychology. And he did it by just having a single insight, which just revolutionized the field. And that ability to spot the one thing that other people aren't looking at, and then show how it can just transform everything, that's what human intelligence is. That's what human genius is. And I think if you don't know the work of Martin Seligman, I imagine a lot of you do if you're watching his podcast, but if you don't, look at it, and then just also broadly, just look at his career and just see how he could have that flash of insight, and it could just have so many transformative effects outside of psychology. And I think what you're talking about in terms of your optimism is the understanding that humans are capable of just having that one insight, which just changes everything. So in terms of education, what's the problem with education? We could talk about this for a long time, but the main thing that bothers me about education is we've known for over 30 years that the longer the kids spend in school, the less creative they get. And what blows my mind about that is not that school makes kids less creative, but that we've known about it for 30 years and we haven't done anything about it. And what that's telling you is that not that we don't care about creativity, but we're just so trapped in thinking things have to be this way that we've given up hope. And as a result of that, we're sacrificing our most precious resource, which is children, and their most precious resource, which is creativity, because that's what's going to make the future that you're talking about. Yes. Those are those new perspectives. And so a big thing that I just want to do with school is shift away from all of the emphasis that we have now on standardized tests and math and evaluations, all these kinds of things, because what those teach kids is that there's an answer and that the teacher has it. And if you walk into a classroom and you think there's an answer and the teacher has it, what that's telling you is that if I don't have the answer, right, I need to ask for help. As opposed to if we create schools which are like, we don't know what the answer is, but we're here to help you find it. And then what that does is that shifts autonomy back to the student. The student is like, nobody knows the answer, even the teacher, but the teacher's here to assist me in going through uncertainty and growing and developing. And so the main thing for me with school is we just have to shift the center of power from assessment, from that whole structure, and put it back in the children, back in students, and let's see that they have the power to change things, because ultimately school is there for them. They're not there for school.
Wow. I feel like that could scare a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. It does. And I think it has over decades. I mean, you've talked about people who actually tried to change the system. legislation and educators who tried to do it and pretty much were shut out and shut down. Here we are in 2025. But I think Marty's work, or positive psychology, when we are reminded after COVID, with divisiveness habit with politics, with technology, how separated we are. We're reminded how important the tribe is, coming together, being social. So school, or an environment of creativity, seems more important than ever on the planet.
It is. Yeah, no, it is. And so to pick up the two things you said there, first of all, it is impossible to change the school system. Like, it is actually impossible to change the school system. And I know this because I've been talking to people who've been trying to change the school system for their entire lives. And so a big part of what I've done is I've shifted my focus from school to summer camps. And I work with the American Camp Association. And summer camp is this great opportunity for everyone to go out there. You've got this huge free open canvas, which is your summer. And, figure out, what do I want to do with it? Do I want to send my kids out into nature so they can start to kind of look? Do I want to send them to an art camp so they can start to create? What do I want to do with my summer? And the American Camp Association has been an amazing partner with me in thinking of these ways to stimulate children's creativity, their self-efficacy, and their resilience. So to your point, we do need to get back in contact with each other, and school is not going to be changed. So we have to start figuring out ways to build communities outside of these existing institutions, and know that the more that we do that, the institutions will then change. Because ultimately, those institutions are responsive to the communities outside them. Mm-hmm. But we have to stop kind of, I think, beating our heads against the same old paths and realize that we have this freedom as humans to go outside the existing tracks and create revolution from outside.
I just, when you said impossible, I was thinking, well, what would Orville and Wilbur think? So impossible. Here's, it's so funny because I'm an actor at my core. That's what I am before I'm anything, right?
Actors, smartest people in the world. And this is true because I spent a lot of my career in Hollywood working with actors. People don't understand that, because as an actor, you have to know the whole story, but then forget the whole story to live in the moment. And everyone else in the world either doesn't know the whole story or can't forget it, right? But you know what I'm talking about. As an actor, you have to hold it, yeah. And that is the highest form of intelligence.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. I have so many people are going to watch this and love that you said that, because I think, and I do want to end up talking about identity and belonging and meaning and mattering. And I know that actors and artists, struggle with that. We struggle with, identity, what's important, meaning, mattering, all of that. So I would really love to jump into it. But I want to share just one little anecdote. Is before I went to Penn, I got my master's at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. So as an older guy, I'm in with a much younger cohort, right? And I really, even though I was running two companies at the same time. So I would run the companies in Los Angeles at night, and during the day, be a part of this cohort at RADA. And everybody was super generous. And I really gave myself over. Just gave myself over. But I'm reminded how sometimes I really struggled to get down on the ground with my toddler and just give myself over.
Yeah.
Not worry what I look like, not worry how I sounded, to really shut everything else out and to be there fully. And where I'm going with that is, I think, yes, on the children, but I think we have to find that right now in all of us, is where we really can get down on the ground and shed it and just throw caution to the wind and play, because I think that's our way back in.
I do too. Yeah, no, 100%. And you discover this. The people who are watching this, who are actors, already know this, but what that moment is of self-transcendence. That self-transcendent experience. That's what historically has been called spiritual experience. But it means that moment where you forget yourself because you're so engaged in the bigger narrative, the bigger story that you're a part of. And when you're an actor just doing kind of one-on-one things, so I should tell people that I am not an actor. And in fact, the moments where I've been forced to act have been dreadful, totally dreadful. Because I have a long history with working with Shakespearean actors and other actors at Royal Shakespeare and other places. And I've often been forced to do things like improv, and it's totally embarrassing. I'm really awful at it. So I don't want to make it seem like this is coming from a place of experience. This is coming from a place of total ignorance and awe. But as an actor, that the moment that you achieve real acting is when you're actually focused on the other person's performance. And you're so focused on what they're doing, and then the performance just comes out of you in response automatically. And then you develop this kind of wonderful chemistry on stage. And then over time, if you're working in a play night after night after night after night, the whole play starts to become that organic process where everyone is lost in the play, the big play, And as a society, that's what we need. We need to be able, just like you're talking about making that connection with your son or your toddler, right? What's important there is you're actually part of their story, right? And that's how you find your story. And each of us needs to start finding our connections to other people's stories to find the bigger play.
Wow. Oh, wow. I mean, really to put that in perspective is, but driving across the country and really connecting with people, really just even if it's just saying hello. I got in the elevator and just had a conversation with the whole family about my ice cream that I bought at the 7-Eleven, and, kind of like where they wanted to get it and, let them know there was a Baskin Robbins. But I got out of the elevator. It was like, there was actually real connection, right?
Yeah.
And I shed
So
myself.
this is this thing that's incredible is when you travel, you spend so much time in elevators with other people, and 99% of that time is everyone trying to avoid talking to the other people in the elevator. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And everyone immediately gets on their phone. I mean, you've seen this all the time, right? Everyone's, but actually that's the moment for self-transcendence because you're going to have a conversation with someone that you're never going to see again.
Yeah.
And that's actually what theater is. Theater is the story that stops existing the moment that the curtain comes down.
Yeah.
That's what's different between theater and film, right?
Yeah.
Because you treasure the moment so much that it doesn't matter to you that it's not going to live tomorrow. And it's that same connection that you can form in the elevator with other people, right? That we want to form constantly in our lives, saying, this moment matters so much that I'm not thinking about a minute from now when the two of us are never going to see each other again. Yeah. What I'm thinking about is this connection we're having over ice cream, right? And the sense that like we are meeting in this moment, and this moment is actually all that matters. And the capacity that we have to do that is what I think is going to save us all.
Yeah. When you said the capacity that we have to do that is what's going to save us all, right? I mean, that sounds grandiose, but it's possible.
Oh, yeah.
It really is possible.
It's happened before.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens a lot in human life, and we've all had these moments in our lives when we have been saved, at least for that period of time. And we've been saved in that moment because the other person has made our momentary existence more important than their existence. I mean, that's what love is on some level. And I think all of us in our lives have received love from somebody. And most of us have hopefully given love to somebody. And the ability that we have to do that and the memory we have of those moments, the stories we have locked in ourselves of those moments is what allows us to tell those stories forward. So I know that it's possible.
So you said the stories that we have in us is what allows us to tell stories forward. That is your work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because I got to jump to my notes here just a little bit, but I just pulled just a couple of chapter titles from your book. And, the thing is that this book, Wonderworks, I don't want people to be afraid of it. I want them to be excited. We can go, oh man, I don't have time to read anymore these days.
Yeah.
I'm not as educated, I'm not a scholar. And one of the things that I've heard from you is, and when you were talking about different teaching, it can be a graphic novel. It
100%.
doesn't have to be Hamlet. Now,
It's not.
I've got Hamlet down here as an exception. You've got Homer's Iliad, Rally Your Courage, Exit Anger, the Book of Job, and Oedipus, Free Your Mind, Dante's Inferno, and Machiavelli, Jettison Your Pessimism, Giovanni Straparola and Cinderella, The Lucky Twist, right? I want you to talk about that. Heal from Grief, Hamlet, right? And that Hamlet, you say, Hamlet departs from traditional revenge plots to introduce therapeutic pauses so that he can help readers process the grief, or audience members. Energize Your Life, Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. I mean, Feed Your Creativity, Winnie the Pooh, and Unfreeze Your Heart, Euripides, but also Alison Bechdel, Fun Home, which, is just sheer brilliance, right?
Brilliant book.
And so when you say these stories are within us, or that Rick Rubin was blowing his mind reading, right? When we are, feel shame about our education or lack of education, tell us, what tools do we have that we have no reason to feel shame, that we can jump into our stories, our own narrative, and be empowered with that?
Yeah. So we just know that shame and grief are the things that alienate most people from their own stories. So what happens is they feel a sense of shame, and then it makes them want to get out of their own story and deny themselves. Or they feel a sense of grief, and that makes them want to get out of their own story. And that's because essentially what's happening there, when you feel grief, you're living in two worlds. You're living in the world where the tragedy happens, but then you're also trying to live in another world where that couldn't have happened. And so you're divided, right? When you feel shame, it's because you're like, I did that thing, but also I couldn't be the person who did that thing.
Right.
So you're living as two selves. And so what we have to start to understand is that our brain evolved to have grief and shame. These aren't traumatic things that are created by the world. These are experiences that our brain chose to have. Our brain chose to have grief and shame. And why did it do that? Well, because it wanted to give us the feeling of growth. How do you get growth? You get growth by taking two things that don't seem like they fit together and putting them together and seeing how they strengthen each other. And so why does grief exist? Grief exists because there's a rupture in our narrative. There's a rupture in our story. There's something that didn't fit in terms of how we thought the story was going to go. Yeah. But you know what? That thing, once we start to understand it, can strengthen our lives going forward, can strengthen our sense of the world. And so to take the example of the Hamlet chapter, which you brought up, one of the things that people do when something bad happens is they just try and get it out of their lives as quickly as possible, right? They try and dissociate from it. They try and compartmentalize, They say, let's have the funeral and move on. That's famously what happens at the beginning of Hamlet. For those of you who haven't read it, it's an old play by Shakespeare.
And you said it's also the literature that probably moved you the most in your youth.
Yeah. Because when I was a kid, my sister died. And that was a very traumatic experience for everyone in my family, and it really threatened my parents. I mean, being a parent, losing a child, worst thing. And so they struggled with that deeply. And so I spent a lot of time as a child, not only really missing my sister, but missing my family, because I felt, we'd all kind of, fallen apart. And so a big way that I dealt with that is the way that I think most people deal with grief is I just learned not to think about it. And I focused on other things that I felt like I could control. And so I was good in school. I was good at all those kinds of things, and I went on to my life. And it was only later in my life when I had my own daughter that I started to realize that I hadn't processed this grief, because I was terrified, that my daughter was going to die in the same way that my sister died, right? And I had to go through this whole thing of kind of going back to that. And one of the works that really helped me was Hamlet. And Hamlet is a play that's like taught really badly in school. And also, like a lot of times I think people encounter it and they're like, oh my God, this is so boring. What's going on? And one of the really marvelous things we know about Hamlet is that so many people who have felt extreme grief have read Hamlet and healed. And so I just wanted to start from that place. I was like, what is it about this play that for most of us just seems like boring or weird or irritating, but for a small number of people who know what extreme grief is the most cathartic, healing thing they've ever read? And the thing that makes Hamlet different from every other play that had been written up to that point is that basically nothing happens. It's like an incredibly long play where nothing happens. And when you're dealing with grief, that's what you need. You need that pause. You need that pause to kind of process and go through it. And a big part of that pause and that process is learning to have gratitude for the life that was lost. Is to kind of go back and instead of feeling like anger and rage at the world for taking that life from you, feeling a sense of gratitude and joy for the fact that you had encounter with that life, And so a big part of that for me, reading Hamlet, was going through processing my grief over my sister and sort of deepening my connection with my daughter and my son. And so that's an example, I think, of just how literature can help us with those processes. You don't need literature. If you have someone in your life who can be Hamlet, that's great. But most of us don't want to put that emotional burden on someone else. And that's where the literature is there for.
Amazing. So Polonius, his death, has more significance than I probably have ever attributed to it. If that is kind of the first event that coming out of things.
That's right.
I mean, it is kind of right.
Yeah.
I'm going to look at that in a different way. Tell me about the lucky twist.
All right. So the lucky twist, this comes to the fact. So don't hate me for saying negative things about Disney. I just got to put that out there because I'm going to say some negative things about Disney. I just want to say that if you like something, it's good. So don't pay any attention to the stupid professor, right? But I'm just going to tell you some of the science. So one of the things that we have noticed in our lab is that when people watch Disney movies, Disney fairy tales, they often feel better immediately afterwards, but they feel worse over time. And so we've noticed this weird phenomenon where people watch Disney And over time, it makes them less happy, right? And they keep going back to Disney to feel happy, but it makes them less and less happy. Whereas in the old days with fairy tales, before Disney got involved, it turned out that people would listen to a fairy tale and it would be a little bit challenging, but then their overall life would get happier and happier. And they wouldn't need to keep going back to the fairy tales. These fairy tales would have this transformative effect. And without talking about the Disney part of it, let me just talk about what's going on in the original fairy tales. And what's happening in the original fairy tales is they make you believe that it's possible for good things to come from bad things. And this is illogical. And in fact, this is something that was eliminated from fairy tales in the 18th century because people went back and were like, oh, it's impossible for good things to come from bad things. So they rewrote all the fairy tales to make it so that good things were coming from good things. But it is actually possible in life for good things to come from bad things. In fact, that's actually the source of many of the best things in your life, right? Many of the best things in your life have come from pain. Wisdom comes from pain. Strength comes from pain. So many good things can come from bad things. And what happens in fairy tales, in the classic fairy tales, is things will be bad, 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 worse, worse, terrible, tragic. And then all of a sudden, for no reason at all, everybody's happy at the end. Like this fairy just shows up, or the prince just shows up, or some magical twist occurs. And that reminds our brain of all the times in our own life where serendipity has struck.
Right.
And the impossible, right, has happened, right? The impossible has become possible. Yeah. And so those, if you ever feel like, this is a Martin Seligman thing, shout out to Marty. If you ever feel like you're catastrophizing, what happens in catastrophizing? Catastrophizing is when something goes wrong, and then in your mind you think, well, because something went wrong, things are going to keep going wrong. And because things are going wrong in my life, it must be because there's something wrong with me. And so therefore I'm making everything wrong. And you just get worse and worse, and you just get to this really low point where you're like, I meant to have a terrible life. I'm a bad person who's experiencing bad things because, negativity. And if you ever feel like that, read one of these classic fairy tales and it reminds you, no. The greatest happiness can come out of the lowest tragedy.
Yeah. Even in the simplest terms, I almost know that if I just stop thinking about something at all, when I least expect it, it sneaks in and I'm like, oh, shit, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just even on that. But I think having lived now a reasonably longer life, that with all the bad stuff that ever happens, I know that I can come out on the other side.
You can, because you have that experience. You know what I mean? What's really fascinating is this is also something we know as children. So if you look at a child's life, their life is really hard. As adults, we romanticize children's lives a lot,
Yeah.
but it's really hard because you're born into a world where everyone's saying stuff you don't understand. You're constantly being told that everything you're doing is wrong. You're constantly being picked up and put places. You're like, I don't want to do that. And then you're being fed food that you don't want to, and your entire life, you're constantly reminded, but then you learn to walk and you learn to talk, and you do these really hard things. You leave your parents and you go to kindergarten, and you're constantly doing these really hard things. And then what happens is we hit a point in our life, when we're maybe in our teens or early 20s or something like that, where we forget that we did all those really hard things as a kid, and then we stop believing that we can do really hard things. And then some people like you had the experience of doing those hard things in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, and then they remember it in their 40s and their 50s, and they're like, of course I can do it, Yeah. But the key is we have to help people at that other point in their life, right, who aren't feeling that. Remind them you have done hard things. By being a human being, you have done really hard things. Just by getting to the point you are, remember that, remember your story, and then remember that forward, And so just as you have that wisdom, they can have it too.
Geez, I mean, that it perfectly brings us to belonging, identity, meaning, and mattering. And, I feel as though a lot of the world right now is under duress.
Yeah.
Right? Where there's a lot of people that are very lonely, very isolated, angry, but I want this conversation to be for all of them, for all of us. But I do want to call out the younger people right now that things are changing at beyond lightning speed, beyond anything that, beyond the internet, beyond, the locomotion and, all of those technical advances that have happened over the centuries. Right now, it is a really challenging time for young people. What might you share with them when it comes to that belonging and mattering and meaning in their story, this narrative that you're talking about?
Yeah. So just a couple of things real simply. First of all, you can do it. And second of all, you're going to do it faster together. And we all know that, right? That like all of us have this power in us. That power becomes so much stronger when we make these connections. And where do these connections come from? They come from conversations. And the most important part of a conversation is not sharing your opinions. And this is something that like has happened in the modern world, right? Where everyone thinks that like the purpose of a conversation is for me to share my opinions with you and tell you what I think is right and tell you what I think is wrong. And we're going to have a debate over this, that, or the other thing. And this is another problem with school because school encourages this view. Actually, this is something really interesting I learned from working with the Green Berets, who are this kind of special operations unit. The Green Berets have to go into all these foreign cultures and they have to build what they call rapport, or in other words, trust. Yeah. How do you build trust with people? You tell them the honest story of your own life. And so what I would say to young people is start having those conversations with people where you're telling them the honest story of your own life. And the honest story of your own life isn't just like, I feel bad, I feel lonely, I feel these things. It's telling them how you got to that place. You know, what did you do yesterday? Walk me through that so I can understand it. And having the courage to tell those things, because a lot of us don't have the courage because we think it's trivial or meaningless. We're ashamed to talk about the minor details of our lives. We're ashamed to talk about our failures. No. That's what's really important is to start sharing those moments. The more you do that, the more the other people around you start sharing those moments. This, by the way, was discovered by a poet called Sappho. Anyone who cares about Sappho, she basically was the first poet to start talking about her vulnerability, her embarrassment, her shame, her fragility. And she created this revolution in the ancient world, which I think is the reason that we have a lot of the great things we have in our world today, including democracy, is because of her poetry. And so just realizing that on a one-on-one level, sitting down with someone you don't know, sharing a story with them that you're afraid to share, but sharing the full story, then listening as they share their story back. So the two of you are sharing stories and not rushing when someone tells you a story to be like, oh, I totally understand how you feel. But instead just like dwelling in what's special or different or unique about that story and really kind of treasuring and savoring the fact that someone has told you something individual and unique about themselves.
You know, I to me, that is like music to my ears. I believe it 1,000%. And one of the things, you know, and I think my son would be okay with me sharing this, you know, he's about to turn 26, as I said, but, you know, he went to film school. So he's not too far out of film school. He did it during COVID. He did it during George Floyd, during politics, during everything that's going on. And he went to a pretty prestigious film school, right? He's an artist. Sharing his vulnerability many times got kind of used incorrectly by somebody else.
Sure.
Thrown back, shared with people that it wasn't invited to do.
Sure.
And you know what happens is we retreat.
Yep.
So what advice might you have for both the person who shared and the one who's, you know, shared with?
Yeah. No, and that's a great point. Well, the first thing is the most important person to share your story with is yourself. So more than anything else, get comfortable with sharing your story with yourself. And when you have the power to share your story with yourself, you don't need to share it as much with other people, you know? So, and I think a lot of the value of you know, being an artist, being a creative is you create a kind of imaginary audience in your mind and you're sharing your story with them, right? So that's the first thing is if you feel in that vulnerable place, focus on sharing your story with yourself, being honest with yourself, you know, telling your story to yourself. The second thing is know that if people are sharing your story, it's making you stronger. Even if it makes you feel vulnerable or taken advantage of in those moments, because what you're doing is the most courageous and brave thing. And when that story gets out there, sure, there might be some people who, because they're afraid of how they might be appear, might mock the story, you know, might do these kinds of things. But eventually that story is going to get to somebody who it needs to get to, and it's going to make them feel strong and it's going to make them feel brave. And all those people that are mocking the story, making fun of it and taking advantage of it, they know that inside. They know that they're alienated from themselves. And you're putting pressure on them to make them change. So I would say that even though it can feel humiliating those moments, and I definitely know what it's like. I've said here's a ridiculous story, but when I was a kid, my parents didn't have a lot of money and they wanted me to kind of grow up right. So they sent me to go work on a farm for a summer. And then I ended up going to a private school on scholarship. And we were taking a tour of and I think I was about 9 years old or something at this time. We were taking a tour of a sewage processing plant. And the teacher goes, wow, I've never smelled anything like that before. Have any of you? And I said, oh, yes, I did. I said, I did when I worked on the pig farm. And if I can give you one piece of advice, right, when you're a 9-year-old kid who's on scholarship at a private school, if you say, I know what that smells like because of when I worked on a pig farm, you're going to get mocked for years, right? For saying that, right? For years, I was like the guy from the pig farm, right? Oh, it's the pig farm guy. You know what I mean? I remember I was so ashamed for years. I was so embarrassed, But then as I got older, I was like very proud of my young self. And I started to realize like that young self told the truth. And the fact is that all of those kids were making fun of me because they were just alienated from the world. I mean, there are people who work on pig farms. There's nothing wrong with that, right? In fact, those are the people who give us life. So I just want to put out there that I understand what it's like to feel humiliated when your story is shared, but also know that your older self will be proud of you for doing it.
Yeah. Oh, God, thank you. Amazing. I know you got a heart out, so just a couple other things that I wanted. I mean, I could stay here for a while.
Yeah, this is also, yeah.
You said the most amazing thing just now is tell yourself the story, your story. Get to know your story, right? And I was thinking, this is not because you and I had a little bit of an exchange about Joseph Campbell and the hero's story, and I think of Robert McKee and Sid Field and the great screenwriting teachers, and you teach screenwriting, and I feel as though this is a really important time for us to maybe look at story differently, look at screenwriting differently, and we don't have to be actors, we don't have to be screenwriters, just to look at these. And when you said know your own story, I really and by the way, the hero's journey, my favorite thing that you said is there isn't just one,
right?
Right. And so when you say get to know your own story is, yeah, there's all kinds of hero's journeys.
Yeah. That's the thing is all of us live with the stories that we've been told by previous generations. And those stories have been really powerful for us, and a lot of us grow up wanting to be characters in those stories that we've been handed. And that's great, right? Because those stories are really powerful. But don't ever forget that you have your own story. Don't ever forget that you were born with the capacity to change the future. And what makes life is the story, right? The narrative that we're living. And all of us have that capacity to be that new storyteller, to find that new story. And it comes from going into our own lives and being honest with ourselves about the moments that are hard. Why? Because those hard moments are conflicting with something. They're conflicting with something in our world or in ourselves, which means they're the starting point of a new story. Why? Because every story comes from conflict. We all know this, right? That's the genesis of every story. So go into those moments that are hard to share, that are hard to think about, and focus on them a little bit and say, what is this new thing here? What story is it challenging outside of myself? And then just start to put it down on a piece of paper. And that's your way of sharing it with yourself, taking it out of your brain and making it real outside of yourself on this piece of paper. And start thinking about that story. And then the important thing about that is if you're deciding maybe you don't want to be a novelist, maybe you don't want to be a screenwriter, value that in other people. When you start seeing a story, you don't understand it immediately, don't get impatient with it. One of the things that's been really, I think, destructive about the way that the internet and social media works now is we just have very little patience for things that don't engage us immediately. And we've become used to inhabiting these frictionless environments where we think that the purpose of the world is to please us and to make us happy, as opposed to really the purpose of the world is to challenge us and spark our curiosity. And so I would just say to people, like when you're having a conversation with someone and they seem a little bit different than you're expecting, when you sit down and you start watching a movie and you're like, I don't know where this is going, lean into that.
Yeah.
Say, this is a moment of change for me to challenge myself and learn about a bigger story outside of myself. And so really, like I think you and I both agree with this, is that stories from the past, like The Hero's Journey, like Joseph Campbell, these have been really powerful and important. Star Wars, great movie.
Yeah.
But there are future movies which break those rules and do new things. And those are the stories that are going to change the future, make the future. And we have to encourage the power in ourselves, but also in the people around us to make those stories real.
Oh, so we're going to have to do this again, but I'm not going to let you leave without talking about fragrance.
Okay. Yeah.
And for me, I said fragrance and that was the exchange, but it's for me, it's scent, it's smell. One doesn't have to talk about fragrance or luxury fragrances or niche fragrances. You said you worked on a pig farm, and when I was coming on my motorcycle through Indiana, there was a smell that lasted most of Indiana. I'm just going to tell you, right? And I was curious, what is it that I'm smelling? What is it? Is it pig farms or whatnot? And where I want to go with this is story thinking or narrative. You can talk about this more. I believe you said it's one of our most primal. It's before language, right?
It is before language. Story exists hundreds of millions of years before language. Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of years before language.
Yeah.
But scent existed then too.
Yes.
Smell
Yes.
existed. It seems that somehow scent and smell doesn't get the love that is a part of all of the stories. I mean, whether it's nursing mother, smells from in the womb, all the smells as a baby, all these, and I was just talking with Dr. Kimberly Dickman, who's a MAP grad as well. She teaches at the Air Force Academy. And she said that when she asks cadets about smell, a huge majority of them say one of their most favorite smells that creates emotion and memory is manure and gasoline.
Yeah.
Right? Because that reminds them of working with their father and whatnot. So for me, with both positive psychology, but as a tool in our toolkit of things that are available, it doesn't have to be a perfume bottle, right? Kimberly talked about a dog of hers that had the worst breath in the world and what she wouldn't do to be able to smell that breath again. These dogs no longer with them. And so where does that come in? Where do you think that might play in to this narrative discussion?
So I'll tell you what I think, but I got to be honest, I'm not an expert on scent, and so I would trust what you think more than what I think. But what I think is that, as you've talked about, scent is incredibly powerful at evoking memory. And memory are the parts of our story that are most important to us. And so I think one of the huge values of scent is to help us go back to those moments like we're talking about in terms of the gasoline, the manure, those kind of primordial moments in our past, and give us the kind of courage to unearth what has become our own unconscious, to go back through our story. And I think there's nothing more powerful. All of us have had that experience of smelling something and then suddenly going back 20 years, or suddenly going to another part of the world. Yeah. And our brain is remembering those things for a reason. And if we go to that place and we don't feel fully comfortable there, we have to say, what have I not taken from that place that I need to integrate into my life? And so for me, a huge value of scent in general is for forming those memories that become the basis for our life story.
You've said courage a few times in this conversation. And, I would just love to ask you as we, finish up this conversation, what's your hope for today? What's your hope for tomorrow? As we have these discussions, but as we try to move forward and connect or reconnect again.
So I just think there's a lot of human potential that we are wasting. I mean, we've never had more people on the planet, and we've also never had more problems, it seems like. And so what I think about when I think about hope in the future is I think about how can we unlock more of that we have inside ourselves and start to connect it with our world and with our environment. And I don't think we're very far away from that, just like you have been saying. I mean, I think the fact that our entire sense of ourselves can shift when we smell something, shows you how close to the surface all of this power is. And I really think that the sort of challenge for the future, but also the opportunity for the future, is for us to start to say, can I be just a little bit more honest with myself about myself? What the modern world has really encouraged is something that I would call dissociation. Dissociation is when you kind of imagine a life outside of yourself, and anything that's inconvenient to you about your life, you sort of pretend like it doesn't exist, as opposed to association, which is you own everything about your life. You own your family, right? You own your own history. You own your community. When there's a problem, you don't say, who caused that problem? You say, I caused that problem. And then people say, well, you weren't anywhere near that problem. You say, I don't care. I caused that problem. I own that problem. And the more that we can start to associate and own those things, own our own lives, own the lives of the people around us, own the lives of the community around us, the more we empower ourselves to just take this huge intelligence we have and change.
Wow. So you said there's more people than ever, there's more problems than ever, and that we should maybe not look for frictionless. So it feels like we're set up to win if we're open to it.
I think so. Look, I mean, just remember, conflict is the start of a story. So don't shy away from friction. Don't shy away with tension from other people. Be grateful for tension. Be grateful for the fact that maybe you and your partner or you and your kids disagree about things. See that as an opportunity for growth. Once you see that as an opportunity for growth, see your conflict with your colleagues and the people in your neighborhood as a source of growth. That's what produces democracy, is that positive tension, that kind of willingness to be in discomfort and hang in there and grow. So I do have a lot of hope for the future, because certainly I think a lot of us are feeling uncomfortable right now. And I think all we need to do is learn how to turn that discomfort into growth.
Amazing. So now you can see why this is the man that blew my mind and continues to do it. Super grateful to have you here, Dr. Angus Fletcher. I hope to do this again with
you. It was a huge pleasure. Look,
Yeah.
Welcome to Columbus. Thanks for driving across the country to see us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hey, by the way, follow us on Free Yourself and Flourish. Keep following the tour. I got 2 days left. Send out the good words so I'm safe on the ride. All right. Take it easy, everybody.